Hello everyone, today we talk about early modern soldier. Today I was not to make yet another video, but not to remain behind, and also because I love my routine. I decided to do so. I had an interview. There is something coming out in cooperation with another channel. It was just like, I don't know, something I did. I will tell you when it comes out. Probably at the beginning of next month. Nothing big, not a big deal, but it's something on Lithuania. And I know that many of you come from that video made about medieval Lithuania between the 13th and 14th centuries. Just for the record, also if you listen to this later, then after that's gonna be published, I guess you can go check that out. Today we talk about, say, how I ventured into early modern warfare from different points of view, like sociologically, anthropologically. Like they're not just my first things, but I firstly talk about politics and actual warfare. But of course, it's fascinating to look at the human material behind the showdowns that we study as battles, and considering what warfare was concretely about. And of course, one has to understand Clausewitzianly where these guys came from, socially, politically, etc. And there are different. Today we can talk about different aspects of warfare. If you want a broader economical one, like say, how worth was it really to go out there fighting, and what kind of lifestyle that was. Like, it was terrifying. There was no need for even introducing that, and that practically early modern armies were made up of the scum of the earth, especially because of the mercenary character of the armies to some extent, but mostly because I actually think that mercenaries were always the best choice in that sense, but mostly the dynamics that had brought in Europe to sort of put together, like, in fact, the systemic leftovers socially wise, as we will see now, that just guys were notoriously enforced into enlisting, and they were press ganged at some point. They were very different. Today we do not stick to any specific century here. It's from the 16th to the 18th, to the beginning of the 18th, and I made other videos on the same topic, but let's touch on these various aspects like mortality, general, being a soldier at this time. There are some economical perspectives. First of all, like, the soldiers were soldiers because they were paid. The term coming from solidus, from the money. But behind the money, of course, there was also, say, the pay proper. There was the hope of loot, right, of booty. So looting in general, sacking, like, within certain limits, were part of a general custom that was thus considered officially legitimate also by the rules of war, which was functional really to the limits also those times, capacity of actually paying the troops. That many mutinies led to some of the most violent and brutal sacks, right, that occurred in the period. Think about the one of Rome or Antwerp, and others were really carried out system. Think about the one of Magdeburg, but even the potential ones, like the same Landsknechten, for example, that had been called to protect Vienna by the Turks at the beginning of the 16th century. When they defeated the Ottomans, they asked for their money to the emperor. Otherwise, they said they would have essentially massacred the Viennese, just like the Ottoman Turks would have done if they had taken the city. So this is fascinating, because also in the video about the Landsknechten, we have observed how much of a sort of union existed within this, especially with the Landsknechten, probably the idea that within the empire there was a sort of a state on their own, and that as such they could require, for example, particular rights and enforcing fact, this payments as well. Of course, it was part of a system we have analyzed in other videos, showing how limited, of course, even the imperial capacity in direct control of their forces really was at some point. There was always something shady about looting and just the moral justification of that on the grounds of, yes, these are enemies, they may be even confessional ones, but how legitimate is it to really pillage and essentially, like, it's not much just the requisitions, but the general distractions, the violence that came with that. You can imagine all kind of, rapes, killings, and so on. Which is really normal because it's also, there's a part of, loaded, frustrated young men that need to vent their, their rage, their instincts. And these, that's like what I like to stress every time. Today we have intercontinental missiles, we have tanks, we have helicopters. But at the time, like, the really only smashing thing that existed was a bunch of these guys, in the world as factual manpower, but military power. You couldn't quite even stop this, like Wu could, right? Again, this is how some important sacks happen, even against the will of their commanders, that at some point sort of accepted it just because they couldn't stop it anyway. This naturally generated some problems, like aside from one could study the systemic impact of warfare on the various populations. Just recently we talked about 17th century brutality, and we were talking about like how many people did really and actually die in Germany during the 30 Years' War. It's not even really that clear. The socioeconomical inquiries, demographic ones, are sort of quite difficult to properly measure with some objective, like absolute metrics and factors. But what we see unavoidably is riots, like indiscipline in itself just contributed to alienate the sympathy of the populations of the occupied countries. Right? For a part of the early modern age, we really see even the lack of a real distinction between the civilians and the military. This, of course, to some extent did happen, like in Europe. We sort of always know who the soldier was. In many ways, it's just the guy who goes out armed, right? Except, of course, also the so-called civilians can. But there is an increase, of course, in the distinction at this time. There had been since the 14th century, telling the truth. And one problem that could invest even your own lands, as far as your own soldiers were concerned, is that, of course, once you had, first of all, politically alienated the sympathy of a community that maybe had paid for the same soldiers or whatever, it was a big problem. But probably the damage caused, like in as much as the tearing apart of the productive fabric of the country, well, that's something that, especially in these pre-industrial times, is very difficult to put back together, working. In fact, many wars came to severely, even sort of redirect certain expansion directions. Like one region was brought down or depressed by structurally, systemically by a war for generations, right? If you especially, it's not much about agriculture per se. It's literally the people who live there, who have fled, who have been killed, etc. So that's also time which you can't reconstruct on the basis of the parish registers, if you're lucky just to have them, but the overwhelming majority being lost forever without any hope of coming back. Like any kind of movement or like tracing who lived there, it's really complicated, right, for most of Europe to do so. We don't even know it for the beginning of the 20th century in some parts, so you can imagine for like the 1600s. For this reason, the high commands already from the end of the latter there had been some resignation to accept fundamentally that the soldiery would, generally speaking, be prone to this. Like, again, the coercive power of the early modern state was not so strong at that point to simply be able to control this armed force put out there. This is very interesting because it shows you also how there is nothing materialistic or deterministic about it. Like, once you have put together this force of armed human beings that knows, it has received that level of training, of armament, whatever, and knows why it's out there, and how it's the world around, you can't quite simply disband these guys. They know what kind of power they have, and they're going to truly use it as they like. And the commanders are sometimes risking their own life, right, when they put themselves like against this action. Among the other things, of course, consider that pay was, as we've seen, just unfrequent, irregular in many ways. So it's the same governments that, in spite of the constant effort to find the money fundamentally for war, they couldn't quite, would accept the normality of this sort of problems. Like, it's just another factor that you have to account by a certain degree, and just know some of your soldiers are going to desert, are going to go out there and do stuff and damage, and it is tragically normal, so that at some point you don't even care. By the way, you can even exploit the thing politically if you want to weaken, I don't know, a certain area rather than another, even of your own territories. There are people, as a medievalist, I have a general interest for the like the sense of like legislation, for example, that describes to us the few information that we have, say in the 9th century, in full Carolingian Europe, like this Christian army saying, when Lent is approaching, avoid to burn churches and to commit adultery, right? And this is approaching the Lent, as if the rest of the year it was sort of normal to do this, or this could happen. Let's try to limit that to some moments at least, and let's not make God too angry for this, because again, these things were not incentivized or accepted morally, but they knew they would go, they would be happening. Regarding the pay, great part of the also beast-like venting on the surrounding population could come out of reasons that are not merely predatory in nature. Like you say, these guys were not paid, so they just began to kill people. Say, predictably, I would say, knowing human nature, like this is not actually even the main answer. Like, these people were, and here I don't have time to digress on the psychology of it all, but these guys did not understand essentially what the limit between, like, again, civilian and military really was. I mean, killing people is all they knew. And these were completely traumatized individuals who would just be dysfunctionally, killing, raping, whatever, like, without any problem whatsoever, because they just had to stay awake and alive. This happens all the time. It's not even that, they were all like this, or that there wouldn't be some justice, actually, and penalties inflicted on these guys as a form of, again, of regulation. But it's not even, say, when you look at the loot, you realize that economically speaking, this wouldn't even give you so much back. I mean, if you were starving, yeah, that's what you need. It's in classically economical terms, but in terms of pricing and the possibility of selling the stuff and profiting from it, it's a wholly different story. It is true that, of course, there were merchants always together with armies that were waiting for this loot to be immediately acquired, right? These guys had the money, essentially, would give it to the soldiers, who gave them this loot that they had not consumed, and then these guys could sort of resell them to some extent. There was also regulation of loot. There were some general mechanism through which the distribution of the same had to happen, also hierarchically. It was, again, a right of war, like the right to the spoils. But all in all, like, you could essentially barely sustain yourself with this loot, considering the normally pitiful conditions in which these armies versed in terms of supplies and equipment. So it wasn't also in a war zone actually so much that you could hope to find, not having hopefully been put by the inhabitants to safety. If you think about the long sieges, well, these were actually the chance in which you could stay and stay in a place and while waiting systematically forage, let's say, and essentially rob the surrounding countryside, right? Especially close to, I mean, the siege of some center was more productive, so with a more, think about this also strategically, a more productive interland, right, that had allowed the settlement to exist in the first place. So that overlaps at a logistical level as well. You need, you can't supply, you can't get more stuff from this area in the first place. You could, even if you think about the sacks of the same settlements, after the siege had run, like the few people who had remained would have just consumed most of their own supplies, right? So aside from, of course, the riches of, think about the churches, the palaces, the monuments, the properties, but in general, like, there was something, in fact, even before that brought people to flee with much stuff, right? So again, the economical perspective was much more meager than one might think, right? People could also hide in very clever way things that were really of poor value in the first place, but were very important for them relatively or subjectively. So sacking and setting on fire the stronghold that surrendered, which was, or the city, right, which was the most frequent case. Like the sense is that, if this settlement had surrendered, you couldn't simply devastate it, right? And so unless, like, these guys had resisted till the end, and so consider this, that the local population always helps in the sieges. Like, you can't actually, if we're talking just a fortress of some sort that has an exquisitely military nature in the way it was designed, and in garrison it's one thing, but the city itself, like, it is pretty large. It must be defended by large enough garrisons. Very often, like, the population remained, hoping also to save itself, because the enemy, without possibility of escaping, really, because the enemy would surround the same city at that point. And so if you decided to make a stand, it was a gamble, right? At some point you couldn't get out, if not, like, suffering the consequences of this. And if in that case, like, the city had just kept resisting, and the population was thus accomplice to it, and without the decisive moral majority you can't quite do that. Like, even if the decisive moral majority had been a few people, but still determined enough for the others to do nothing, and so letting them do, it's always a directly proportional mechanism. Well, at that point the population was guilty, and it would be punished. It was still considered as a bad thing. When people complain about, the viciousness of the Crusades or things like that, just it's a liberal cliche. It has nothing historically into it. Is actually the explicit statement in front of things like the sack of Jerusalem, etc., like of the realization of the moral problem this entailed, right? And in this world, you always find that stated. I think a civilization that saw that as it's okay, rather than, I don't know, as a Mongol coming and raising everything to the ground is always sort of an important hallmark of also political reflection, right? It's from these Saxon violence in general that early modern Europe continues to increasingly thinks about itself and can sort of sort out like agreements, conventions, rules, also for regulating these armies and their actions. So it's all very compenetrating all these various aspects, right? But in general, like there is a pretty strong conscience about these things, and even the very famous phrase again, yet another crusade quote, like from the Albigensian crusade, God will recognize his own, is not meaning the usual again whining about the terrible church killed people. Now that literally means yes, we know that there were Catholics that were supporting in the city, but that's what we were saying before, like they were supporting the Albigensians as well, which was true. And so even if those were not the heretics, when somebody rose perplexity to, kill the settlement, the question was, yeah, but who had obliged those to help the heretics? God will recognize his own, like if they have a more orthodox belief. So it's actually part of some conventions that today we should make always the effort of of contextualizing, and not just to say, okay, because those were brutes, right? No, they were by far more intelligent and capable people than you can ever dream to be. So you should actually be a bit humble and realize that you have nothing but to learn from the past. Of course, this also went with gratuitous cruelty sometimes, but you must be interpreting what specific information does mean. All right. So let's admit to some extent that maybe some fortunate as vicious assault to a rich city would squeeze out of it something into the sort of greasy bag of the soldier, right? That something would of course be subject to, like, imagine these soldiers, I mean people who butchered women and children alive. What kind of, this could be a deterrent if somebody wants to steal you something, but think about just the same soldier life, the camp one, the march one, right? What were the chances of you just to even be able to carry functionally something like loot on your shoulders and not to lose it, and not to become, even in some circumstances, actually not as precious in relative terms to the circumstances, like you need to run, for example, and leave this stuff behind, right? So of course there were ways to trade the stuff in different centers that they found. As we've seen, there was a settler train that in part did sort of digest this loot, like they would pay money back and so on. But in general, in the best, say, average circumstance, in fact this loot could be by the individual soldier advantageously bartered, not much more, right? Again, the logistical system did not allow you to bring this together with you during the campaign such important burden, right? It just was just anti-functional. Like if there was any discipline, like how could you even regulate? That's in fact why loot at some level was centralized, right, and distributed in different situations, like in the presence again, or either of very effective, say merchants, like connected with between the with the army as much as some market, or even when they were in fact in the city, maybe the same one they had sacked, like they could still sort of sell the stuff, and the commanders would distribute the loot at the next useful center in this regard. In more realistic terms, every hour passing witnessed the risk of the increasing risk, by the way, of the comrades stealing such, say, attractive or evident loot, right? And so it was not definitely pleasant to sleep with an eye open and with the knife ready, right? With all the post-traumatic stress disorder and violence image of, again, infants cut to pieces, etc. Like that was, maybe not so much in comparison, but these people would like to just be bodies out there and surviving even more than having this wealth with them. It was a broader patrimonial strategy, and so just living out there was better off without too much weight, just with the necessary to stay alive. There was a lot of, however, debt contracted by the soldiers over time. In part exactly because of this reason, that is to say, for example, even when the first uniforms were issued, after 2 months of campaign, you literally don't have a cloak anymore. Like it's just worn out, away, like it doesn't exist. And so the way you have to find food and shelter, etc., it can be connected literally with, or maintain yourself connected with gambling, right? Or even less edifying occasions, such as like keeping to steal and assassinating, something like that. So the best was to go to those merchants that were essentially money lenders in practice, because they profited enormously from this desperation. These merchants were in all the armies, and they would be able to get something in exchange at, very often again, like through blackmail rate of exchange, but still something that could be more easily, like that. Money is easier to carry than a pig, right? So, well, a pig would have probably been eaten and roasted, but let's say something like a religious paraphernalia, for example, that surely was still like, if pikes were shortened because they were too cumbersome for an army, for a soldier during the march, you can imagine anything less handy than that. And also just being extra with the pretty heavy gear that you had to bring with yourself was just to some point unsustainable. We can imagine these soldiers sort of being extremely anxious to get rid of the loot, like in exchange for money, because that was a much easier, like in terms of weight, and again, the way you can literally keep in your pocket, like easier than most goods to carry with you. There was a further earning perspective, which stemmed from the prisoner's ransom. But this was mostly connected with, this was much more centralized, but even loot was centralized in Germany, so the individual soldier could loot some chicken, etc., but it's not that the single most precious stuff could even be simply distributed to, if not by the commander's will, so passing first of all in the common hands. This is, you can see it, think about the vase of Soissons, if you want an early medieval comparison, like of how, even in tribal societies, essentially, like loot was put together at the beginning and then distributed because of the presence of an authority, right? So the prisoners were often, to ransom at this point, were often just important people. So there was much greater sympathy at some point between captured enemies, captured enemies of your same elite status, like if you were the commander, the officer, whatever, then the one with your own troops, right? It was just, again, the scum of the earth. You had nothing to do with that. Whereas when you fought against other noblemen like you, at least you could have some broader, not just ransom, but also chances of political connection, of sort of, contact in the higher spheres, even in such odd circumstance. And frankly, like, this ransom thing for the prisoners is mostly something medieval in nature. I will be not explaining why, but of course, let's say society was becoming bigger, and so to an extent, and also not necessarily less stratified, but at least the most common type of prisoner would not be sort of the top knight that you could proportion, like the top aristocrat you could ransom on a regular basis, and prisoners were also killed at some point. So this is definitely not a very psychologically comforting picture, of course, in which to live. Now, needless to say, regarding the prisoners, is that, of course, if you didn't have a great value, you would more easily be killed, but it wasn't always, or not even necessarily, the case in the majority of circumstances. There were many other negative elements about military life, right? In general, the discomfort, the suffering of the same war, right? There are some letters from this one, I think, dates to 16th century, the early 16th century. A soldier who writes like this: "That night, full of uncertainty and fear, was a great danger of a blind, like a, say, an unknown cause of, say, sound that greatly scared the souls of the French." This is during the Italian wars. So that the soldiers of Antonio de Leva, hearing this noise of combat, actually, they had come out with furor, and in order, because of the increasing fear they had, began to unload from a long distance and pretty much without too much precision, basically, large culverins from the towers. Right, so this is interesting. Like, you're scared, you don't know what's going on, you start shooting to vent and to hope to scare the enemy away. Right, soldiers that, of course, naturally don't sleep easily. People think that this is just about contemporary combat, and that, I don't know, in ancient times, warfare was just like, okay, they go to sleep and then the other day they go to war, and it's just like a sport. No, like, it was as terrifying as it is today. There are incredibly ugly scenes from, fortunately I haven't watched in the entirety, but it's just ridiculous, about series like Vikings, or those are old now, but the complete lack by the producers, by those, of any kind of idea of what actual medieval warfare was even minimally resembling to. A complete masquerade of, bunch of 21st century imbeciles mocking, a high medieval military context without understanding anything about combat psychology or how these things happen. Like, it's just terrifying how these things can even gain any ground in pop culture. And so here it says that these soldiers, as we've seen, and the bodies of the Swiss and the French were so much consumed by the by the cold, right? The winter cold and the long discomfort, that being tired of the wakes and by the frequent skirmishes that at night took place, having often resumed weapons, like in the circumstances while they were resting and they could not go on because of continuous fatigue, they wouldn't desire anything else but ending the war with a quick engagement to free everything of themselves also, like soon. Doesn't matter whether they would have lost or they would have won, just because their body and their soul was so afflicted by so much misery and misfortune, right? This is an incredibly relatable concept. Think about, World War I, trench psychology. Soldiers actually suffering the most when there was no combat, right? The waiting of the next combat is wearing you out. You prefer to actually get out there and getting gunned down by a machine gun or exploding, being torn apart by shrapnel, than this harassing sense of emptiness and of tiredness and exhaustion and pain at every psychophysical level. All right. This is again a passage from the Italian wars in the early 16th century. Read the accounts of World War I, trench warfare, and have the courage of saying that what is described here is worse than the 20th century. And the thing goes on, and since the Pescara was one of the commanders for this only way that had essentially avoided, not really having a prudent behavior, actually not rushing into a combat. Here I'm translating, he had in fact tried to avoid the fury of the French and this term, I don't know what it means, excuse me, I'm gonna Google that because it's fury of the French and the impetus. I think this was actually a mistyping rather than a word that I didn't know, of the Swiss when these were instead animated by fresh forces, right? So the spectacle was miserable, seeing so many dead in different ways, like on the ground with so many horses over them, being thrown in ditches, like as if they, that was the way of burying them, some having a foot still in the stirrup, interestingly enough, and the rest of the person on the ground to be just brought about by the horses here and there, others transpassed by the legs, others by the stalk, others by the furor of artillery, like literally torn into pieces and completely dead, because you don't just die immediately, by the way. Some close to dying, in fact, could be heard making painful lamentations, which, when the night came, was so scary and of such great piety that is not in the heart such somebody so much inhuman that hearing them had not had to withhold tears and had not actually cursed the most cruel ambitions of the heartless rulers, who this is a bit of populism and throwing it to for their greed, right, to increase their enormously vast states were causing so many killings, so many fires, so many bad work. Of course, there was the control of the entire system of, entire Europe at stake, and if one didn't win, the other would, so they were actually fighting to balance each other out, as always. But you hear this, again, in pop culture. You hear, the guys that are dying in no man's land between the trenches, that at night could be heard. It's such a terrible thing. It's World War the First. It's all war. Like, every single war that happened is like this. Like, it's not just about your pop culture impressions of a person that has never probably even cared about studying military history or the art of war, right? The passage says that basically this thing about the rulers, that even if they are born like the other man, albeit not in poverty, at least naked, and being initially as babies essentially, happy just of a few milk that could feed them, and of whichever cloth envelopes them. Well, the cupidity of from this little princess extends in a way that when they grow, essentially they're not content of vast reigns, right? And this is just like the usual story. Oh my God, it's the terrible, leaders. Leaders cannot make wars if they don't have the. They may be wrong about it, but they can't do that without the decisive majority of the population. So whichever country that gets this as a result is, just responsible for it, even when it's somebody else that is. You see, it's like with any crime, right? It can't be somebody else's fault in terms of conventional justice, but metaphysically, like, how much did you do to avoid that yourself? It's two different levels. They're not comparable. They're not meant to be thought to make moral relativism, like most people do with war nowadays. Nobody's is right, nobody's wrong, which means actually always siding in a spasmodic way for a side which is always the worst, and hiding that. That's the only reason why there's always only one side that does this, or at least a massive disproportion in the picture. The death in battle was not even the scariest of the risks, as we've seen. It was rather the conditions of that way of dying that were presenting themselves as painful and really heartbreaking, right? Just like in this case, again, people torn to pieces and suffering all the biological, all the feeling, all the pain. Like, that's what, in fact, movies, I don't think, show enough, because it's sort of painful, in fact. You don't just go down like a mannequin. You just, like, can be out there taking days to die, even with horrendous wounds, right? I don't know how people think how that. Yes, the human body is extremely fragile, but it doesn't mean that. Say you will necessarily die even with a monstrous wound immediately. It's just it can happen, but it's not. Especially also at this point, yes, there was artillery around with things that could smash you, but even just a knife could kill you instantly. But it's just less likely, and just you would have not liked to see, however, an early 16th century battlefield. In fact, especially after the engagement. But there was also legitimately wars of dying even in that way. If you were captured, for example, unless, as we've seen, he could be ransomed, could, for example, become a slave, which was something coming back in Mediterranean with the rise of the Ottomans, so that normally sailors were all rowers, like of the galleys. I made a video about galleys warfare recently, were all historically salaried freemen, and they had actually a pretty damn good job. Like they were very well fed, and they had to be very functional. They had a specific resting time. It was a good job, like for say an average person, and it needed some sort of sound income and some good conditions of work. With the 16th century, start having slaves, right? And it's not entirely like today. We can digress on why this change. Also considering the needs of the galleys, that had not really changed much. So, but the point being that you're a slave, you're treated different, and not necessarily. You would end on a galley. You could end up to other. You would be chained to a galley as a slave. So, interestingly enough, like differently from the freemen before, like if you were to go down, like if you were not fast enough with those rows, and even if you had been, you were taken down, you would have just gone down with the actual ship at that point. But you could just be as a slave, brought to forced labor, treated as an animal, before essentially you would have been freed by your own death. You can't imagine like the degree of violence and incredible levels of torture. So, but this had always happened, right? Just religion becoming more hotly contended, like after the Reformation, the Ottomans arriving, like there are more chances to add to that. Like, if you ended, especially in the hands of the infidels, there was even an option actually to. Not everything was extremely bad. Like for most people, it would be very bad, but you could actually renegade your own fate. You could become a Muslim. Say if you were a Christian, you were captured by some Islamic power, and at that point you couldn't be a slave anymore. And there are in fact some famous Islamic commanders that had been Christian before. It's very frequent in some, say, military history. Like there are lots of these guys, especially from the Islamic side. This, however, could be really different. It's just like saying, think about the Janissaries that were slaves in the elder days. They were literally kidnapped as children, etc. Later on, it became something more like the same parents wanted to give these children, because in the meanwhile, these Janissaries had become so much gentrified that they would have rewarded their parents with land, money, and whatever once they had had successfully become Janissaries. But there were lots of other peoples, for example, that were just the subjects mistreated, even ones of the same religion. There was a concept, different shades of slavery / serfdom that we can't quite descend into, but really some, especially in the Ottoman Empire, some dynamics are fascinating, together with many Ottoman brides, for example, that were, I mean, sultanial brides that were, in fact, slaves, but who became the most important, like, empresses fundamentally. So, I mean, at that level, I made a video about that and the sultanate of women, and we can sort of come back on at some point. That's of course an exception. But the vastity of this world, its complexity, is kind of allow you to sort of go in different directions independently from fealty or flag or the cause that you were supposed to serve. Right, so things were actually possible, like as far as, for example, that the prisoners still in good physical conditions could pass to the service of the enemy just as turncoats, betraying, etc. And the point being that these soldiers were not even less reliable than the ones who would remain fighting under your own banners, right? Not always, so that's not a good sign. Right? Desertion is very high, and for different reasons. It's not just to pass to the enemy, but just know that these things did happen in ways that could surprise us, especially if we consider too rigidly the various alignments that existed politically and socially at the time. As you know, before antibiotics, by far the first cause of death in war was illness. Tuberculosis was, as you know, very, very common. It was the first one. The flu as well. As we know, think about septicemia. Like especially wounds, like you couldn't really heal them, in an effective way, and even a small infection could take you down quite easily, or they could make you become an amputee, and so also an invalid person that once the war was over, could not really quite come back so easily to whichever work they were doing. It mostly were physical works, so it was full of this again, alienated, emarginated veterans that really had not the psychophysical capacity to come back to any kind of normality in the first place. I made a video about the moral and the physical wounds of war for the Renaissance. It's the passage from Erasmus. We'll come back on the many literary sort of references to this reality. The hygiene was not helping, of course, in all this many wounds, that even not serious ones, even for those times medical standards, could become mortal because poorly cured, or because there was, for example, a great promiscuity with horses and mules. You could get tetanus. You name all the sort of wars, like also as a general civilian life, the infections. Like we have no idea of how, for example, how many gastrointestinal diseases, parasites, like the people were normally suffering of on a regular basis. Like, and again, it's a world that perhaps we should make some history of medicine. I would have really liked to do that on Schwerpunkt. That's an idea for a new series, as a matter of fact. I made something about military medicine, but that's not really, like, it's just an excursus, a bit like this. In any case, if you were able to bring your own body home, instead of rotting somewhere or in a box, like if you were more, say, not lucky at that point, you would have not cared, but let's say at least, if you would have, as you would have liked when you were alive, you could, however, get back home without one or two limbs, for example, and thus, as we were saying before, you couldn't work. Yes, in the early modern age, there were some crafts that maybe did not specifically require that, but it was rare. Most people were just peasants, so what could you do? There were some activities, though, even for these people. Like later on, if you look at Les Invalides, etc., there were, of course, some specific mansions that were designed, of course, for people who had, say, lost legs, just working with hands without too much of it. But you may have not been that, say, lucky necessarily. Say you lost your sight. It's a terrifying thing in general, even in the much more disgustingly spoiled life that we have today by extreme scale compared to these guys. And remember that our ancestors were all through this, so we are the product of it in many ways. That makes you understand how much of a miracle it is for us to be alive in the first place, to exist. But in any case, these guys sometimes had families at home. As we will see now, some elements actually of society where these guys had been taken from could be just brigands. I mean, people that surely had a family but that had abandoned it from quite some time. You can imagine all degree also of sort of squalor of, we know what pre-industrial society was in terms of incest or just pretty fucked up family dynamics among, of course, this lower scum of the population. But if you came back home and you had a home and you had a wife and children, whoever, and these had not turned into prostitutes or being sold as and gone to prisoners or something like that, you would be a burden for these people because you were just yet another person to feed. And if you were crippled like that, people would start seeing you just as a burden, right? It's as harsh as it sounds. And in many very concrete ways, considering properly the nutritional difficulties that existed at the time. In fact, that people barely, even working on the fields for a lifetime, given the crop yields at the time in general, economy in general, would have hardly make you understand whether you had even earned something in your own lifetime in terms of living conditions. It's been estimated that, say, I read it for the Middle Ages, it's a very approximate estimate, but that, again, a peasant could produce, could accumulate at most to be saved for a lifetime of work, a 4% extra what had when he had started working. Basically, you wouldn't understand to have changed your life at all, and all this would have happened in a life in which you could have easily even lost everything because of these wars or because of famines or any other kind of issue, and again died pretty early. And this, of course, admittedly, I'm not sure actually whether that average of the 4% includes I hope so, the average life expectancy of the time. Now, you could at that point turn into a mendicant. In pre-industrial times, when people were starting, probably the scum of society was starting to be taken off from the streets and either, segregated or put to work in some more coercive way. You have to imagine, normally lots of, again, mendicants, crippled, any kind of beggar, being out there and living off the very meager surplus of the system. But there was also public assistance already, right, especially for the veterans that was sort of one of the most pressing realities. How many wars existed, how many people would end up like that. And by the way, it was not just, again, the physical damage that would render the soldier, let's say, alienated from his previous life and incapable of being reintegrated, but the general moral decay, the generation that the pretty unhealthy life in the military encampments had opened him to, right? In general, like, yes, you could get ill in the encampments, whatever, but there is something, like, for example, poor food, shocks, traumas of all sorts would just take off life, years of life out of you. Right? You don't go through the 30 years war and say, well, okay, well, it's just, I feel newer than before. Right? There were continuous fears. Right? The perennial state of tension would at some point exceed like the sustainable on the long term, and you would have emerged mentally debilitated from that. Today we don't have time again to digress on the specifics like of these dynamics also psychiatrically, but the like we get so, oh my god, I feel so depressed because I don't know, there is a problem, but you still have a roof on your head, you still have food, you still kind of live your normal life, where in another. How would you react from your moral standpoint today to going to war, but also the type of war that sort of, like 500 years ago, like in the political and social context of those times, like so without even the still what these guys would have seen the luxury of our living standards, even in in war areas, right? You may think like, yes, it's still terrible, but at the time, like you would literally just starve out there in the street together. Today we have that, but even for the wars that are fought, this is less frequent than it was at the time. It was really a bad moment to be a soldier in a perspective, even though it always sucks in general. Obviously, there is no surprise in learning that people who had voluntarily embraced this craft, like had a better way, a better option, right, in life. And yes, living your entire life as a peasant was not that better after all. At least there were many people, of course, that were forcibly enlisted, and this was not, done even just through too many formalities. There were people who wanted to go away from society, or maybe they were just criminals, or people that went in exile to find. Think about the Zaporizhia island of the Cossacks, like people from all over Europe went fighting there because at least it was sort of freer society. People could not simply hunt you down with the police and whatever. Better live like a pirate than ever going back home. Alright, so there are interesting stories of people coming from, especially sailors from this, even forced in, let's say, recruitment that eventually, after many years, a lifetime as a matter of fact, were coming home, or what was left of it. Of course, people had forgotten them. It's a bit like the history of Ulysses becoming old, again, at least in appearance. That's a bit different of a story, but still the idea of will I be remembered even if I leave? Like it's a very interesting perspective as well. And so, what was the point of these guys? What was their aim in life? When you would have come back again, you would have been marked, right? Being a soldier wasn't often much of a presentation, right? There was some sense of pride, and especially starting with, say, permanent armies, national modern armies, like there is a sense of duty, etc. But the reality is, socially, is terrible in many ways. You would often become an emarginated, some sort of, of criminal, a bandit, right? And so when you would have been strolling the streets of Europe of the time, or attending, I don't know, a fair, or entering a sanctuary, there weren't just the people who had sort of managed to stay out of war, but many who had survived the same, and that were part of this pretty, what we would find as some sort of shocking world, right? So the problem of the veterans began to be addressed properly only during the 17th century, because this is the moment in which, again, the national armies are born in a modern sense. The 30 Years' War was so devastating and wide in scale that the problem of the veterans was becoming a mass one, right? This, by the way, posed a problem in terms of the same concept of peace and war, because yes, the end of the 30 Years' War had brought to some of the first sort of international treaties and recognition of, for example, the civilian rights, etc. But bringing back all those veterans into society was sort of negative. Like, it was better actually to have some war going on, because these people would create social, also economical problems for labor force, just social order. So there was some actual function that people killed in war. The soldiers themselves, in a functional sense, were carrying out at a demographic level, right? You could absorb the excesses, especially the social. Once again, the emarginated, all those people who were just forced into the army because they weren't part of a community that could protect them from the recruitment, etc. That appointed directly them, because they were, like, communities were to provide with the levies, with at least the money equivalent of that. So if they could coercively, in an ancien regime culture, just because of their local tribunals, their local laws, like saying it's those guys that have to go to war, they would send them, right? So the presence of too many and exceeding, right, in terms of employment, professionally unqualified youths, right, young males, also troublemakers, etc., was a way to actually fill the ranks of the modern armies. You would send those, right? After all, that's what you need. I mean, war has to be fought with young people that are crazy enough to get themselves killed. It's easy to get humans killed in the first place, but there are certain things that an 18-year-old would do that a 30-year-old wouldn't do, like in combat in general. And so these are the youthful forces you want to send to slaughter on a regular basis, just for how they are designed biologically and socially. So there was someone, of course, coming out of there, not just alive, but maybe with an improved, with actually acquired skills. We've seen it recently in some video, like for example the one about the early modern German artillery. Just artillerists had the opportunity to rise quicker through the ranks, just independently from their status, if they were good at what they were doing technically, etc. So that there were chances of social promotion in the army. In theory, right? This was also just how the enlistment campaigns were carried out, like at least in more civilized times. Look, you will get this profession in the military. Well, except the military is not designed for that. I mean, you can get that as a side aspect of the story, but the primary objective of the military is to turning you into an incredibly efficient killing machine that can take out as many human beings as possible in interest of time. And the military has it's a very good thing, right? Civilization to have people who can do that. That's the primary objective of the military, not other strange deviations from that. So if you consider like what these forces could have acted like in society if they had not been just channeled into the military, like you could say, well, maybe they would have pressured society to do something else, like just because of their problem they would have stimulated, even through initial crisis, some development. Yes, but societies need the military as well, and so you can argue that these guys were actually stabilizing the entire social order by going to war after all. And that's true, because that's all how the Clausewitzian triad of politics, war, and society work. Right? It's a matter of balance, essentially. War was somehow endemic. It was becoming sort of more, not episodic, but let's say at least more structural, more systemic, more concentrated in certain cases. And so you needed also scientifically the knowledge of which section of the population to regularly enlist and for which purposes, right? So you can argue that this is true, like just the metus hostilis and the general conflictuality to the degree by which it does not destroy a community, it surely reinforces it. Hence we can say that war in this early modern Europe was more a factor of general balance maintainment, not of destabilization. Again, depending on the places, there are places were destroyed by war, but largely this happened because others were stabilizing, and sort of the most advanced parts of the continent was in the process. So it's really surely there are so many different aspects we could touch upon, but let's say overall, like aside from the fact that I'm exhausted because I had another video made before this to give that interview, but anyhow, there is always plenty of different suggestions, intuitions that we can start from at some point, and we will talk surely about for example, the increasing divide during the 18th century between the military and the aristocracy from one side, and the civilians and the soldiery from another. Say the officers and the aristocracy and the civilians and the troop, in a sense, even though again it's not really the right contraposition, but the divide between the civilian and the aristocrats did pass through the military, let's put it in this way as well. For today, however, I would stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, do a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.